everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today, returning after about 4 years since the last time I had him on the podcast, is Paul Kengor. He's a professor of political science at Grove City College and the author of many books, including The Devil and Karl Marx, which was the last one that we discussed. And today we're here to discuss his brand new book from TAN, The Stigmatists, Their Gifts, Their Revelations, Their Warnings. Welcome back, Paul.
Thomas, it's great to be with you. I enjoy your work. You and I were dialoguing quite a bit not that long ago about the Cabrini film, which you and I both had things we liked about it and didn't like about it. And so I always enjoy your work on film and culture and in the church. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much. This book covers a broad range of figures, and I wanted to ask, in the first place, why, there's a lot of different groupings that you could use to categorize saints and demographics. Why choose stigmatists as your focus?
Yeah, Thomas, it's a subject I've always been fascinated by. And when I was Protestant and evangelical, I came into the church April 2005, about the time that John Paul II died. And I'm technically a revert, so I was a cradle Catholic, born December 1966, which means I grew up in the church in the dark ages, the 1970s, right? So that kind of explains why I left, right? Anything else needed to be said about that? But I was always fascinated by these people with blood coming out of their palms and their feet, and there's pictures and there's video. People like Padre Pio, who was alive in my lifetime. I mean, he died in 1968, so I was 2 years old when he died. So I don't have any memory of him when I was when he was alive at that time. But I saw the photos, I saw the video, and it's just undeniable. And I knew about how the scrutiny that these people had gone through. I wasn't one of those people who disregarded the Catholic Church, right? Like you'll hear people say on the Protestant side, those Catholics, they believe this miracle, this apparition. I mean, they see the Virgin Mary appear on every street corner when they're walking to work in the morning. I never felt that way. I knew what the church went through in authenticating and verifying, or trying to, miracles, apparitions, and including something like stigmata. And I became particularly interested in Padre Pio. I've read probably more biographies of him than anybody else. And I really saw how he was really put through the ringer, kind of theologically, spiritually, with the scrutiny that he went through from clergy, fellow bishops, fellow cardinals. I was also probably one of my favorite saints as well is St. Catherine of Siena, who had hidden stigmata. That's a whole other category we could talk about. I had a strange kind of attraction to Gemma Galgani, who's one of the ones who's in this book. She was a stigmatist, 1878 to 1903, died at the age of 25. St. Faustina Kowalska, the first saint of the new millennium. I read her diary up and down, often go back to it still, fascinated by the prophecies, the visions, the statements in there about the end times and so forth. And then noticed in the course of reading that she had stigmata as well. She was hidden stigmata as well. So I noticed that a lot of people that I was most fascinated by, who had some of the most remarkable lives, witnesses, revelations, and prophecies, bore the marks of Christ. And so for me, it's kind of like an extra verification, authentication, the Nihil obstat almost, right? Imprimatur, kind of added marking. Many of them are blesseds. Most of them are saints, at least the ones that I focused on. And if a person like that is genuinely exhibiting the wounds of Christ, in some cases decades, Padre Pio 50 years, right, bleeding from their hands and from their feet and from their side, other wounds, and recognized by the church for that, I'm taking that person really seriously. I want to know what they said. It's one thing if the guy down the street from me is claiming that he's talking to Jesus or having visions about the end times. I'd be like, yeah, all right, Jeff, whatever, But if Jeff suddenly starts bleeding from his hands and from his feet and teams of psychiatrists and medical doctors and agnostics and atheists and officials from the cardinals come in and spend 10 years examining him, and then come to the conclusion that he's not faking it in any way. I'm just not all eyes. I'm all ears at that point. So I also noticed, and giving a long answer to your question, but as I wanted to learn more about the phenomenon of stigmatists generally, as like a group of individuals, saints, people, I noticed there's hardly any books on the subject. I mean, hardly anything. And a lot of what we have to go by as Catholics is some really sloppy material on, unreliable Catholic websites with dubious sourcing. I don't know if this is true or that's true. And then if you do find the cases of the stigmatists, you could kind of, okay, all right, it looks like this person was a stigmatist. Then you read the biography or write-up or whatever on the Catholic website, and you wonder, did she really say this? Did he really say this? Is this true? They really have a vision of 3 days of darkness? Is that true? So I started doing my own investigation, and pretty soon I just ended up collecting material, ending up with a box of material, and I thought, I should do a book on this. Try to make it somewhat scholarly, right? A book that the book that I would want to read about stigmatists. So that's what I tried to put together.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, especially with Padre Pio, perhaps because he, is in living memory for many people. There's so many stories about him and people claiming to have his blessing for this or that thing that they're saying or doing. And some of them are, pretty sketchy people. And, I'm perhaps one reason I haven't gotten personally into Padre Pio as much as I otherwise might have is because so many of the stories that I've heard about him seem like I can't tell if this is true or not, or I can't tell if this is, taken out of context. I'm not talking so much about claims of stigmata or his mystical gifts as interactions that he had with particular people. And so many of the stories that are shared about him online are like the intimidating stories, you know what I mean? Like him, he yelled, people say he yelled at this person in confession or, different things. And so I think that sometimes, at least as far as online stuff is concerned, it's hard to tell what is anecdotal, what is really documented, and when people are trying to claim, the Padre Pio seal of approval for different things, that's also kind of hard to follow up on sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. And so a lot of this is for my own peace of mind, right? I want to know, I start digging on my own to find out if something is true or not. In fact, the Marx book that we talked about, a lot of same kind of thing. So I would search for my own primary sources. I mean, I'm a professor, I'm an academic. So oftentimes I will put this stuff together for articles, for presentations, maybe lectures, certainly in the case of Karl Marx. One of the cases in the book, I cover this little Calabrian nun who lived into the 1960s named Sister Elena Aiello. She's a blessed. And she had extraordinary prophecies, including about Mussolini that turned out to be true. And then she had these prophecies about a ball of fire from the sky, end times, chastisement, not necessarily 3 days of darkness, but how's this? 70 hours of darkness? Pretty close, right? I'd probably consider that 3 days. And so I started trying to trace the origins of where some of that material was coming from. I ended up getting one or two of the only Italian biographies done on her. I tracked
and she's
down,
she's a blessed, right?
She's a blessed. She's a blessed. Really extraordinary. I mean, in the case of so many of these people, her and others, it doesn't take long for word to get out in the village, right? That there's a nun in a convent who's bleeding from her hands. In some cases, I mean, Pio had the bleeding continuously for 50 years.
Right.
But in some cases, these women, and I say women because about 90% of stigmatists have been women, which is an interesting thing. But their wounds would start up on like Thursday. And then by Good Friday, right, they're bleeding and then agony, like their own personal passion.
Right.
And then Saturday, boom, they're gone. And they hold out the palms of their hands and they're healed. There's not a trace of anything there. And the priest is there and the bishop is there. And in her case, she's in Calabria. She's only a couple hours at most, probably from the Vatican. Vatican officials are there. Her doctors there. People from the hospital are there. Psychiatrists are there. People are lined up outside the door. You just can't fake this. And this is it'd be impossible to fake something like that. And in Padre Pio's time, he said that some of the worst torment that he had was the doubters inside the church who didn't believe him.
Well, Pope John the 23rd was actually convinced, at least for a time. I don't know if he changed his mind about it or not, but that Padre Pio was he described him in his journal, I think, as like an idol made of straw or something, because people had convinced him that Pio was a fraud. And this was already decades after Pio had been investigated under other popes and sort of not approved per se, but just, sort of allowed back into public ministry and under previous sort of persecutions that he had to undergo. And then the 1960 or so comes around, and suddenly there's all these new fresh slanders, and even the Pope is kind of skeptical of him.
Yeah, by and large, though, I quote all the popes. They all were pretty favorable. I don't think any of them was actually right out negative. But John the 23rd is an interesting case, and I quote quite a bit on that. He had different cardinals going at him about Pio, doubters as well as supporters. And one of the supporters said, told an interviewer, he said, John the 23rd was a good and holy man, but he was really torn because he was getting conflicting points of view. And he didn't have a chance himself to actually meet Pio. And the one cardinal said, I've known the man for decades. He's not a faker. He's a very holy, pious man. Holy Father, you can believe this. But at that time, he was in, John the 23rd was in, 1958 to 63, I believe. Mm-hmm. It was the time of Vatican II. The Pope's a busy man. He can't necessarily just take a ride up to San Giovanni Rotondo and see for himself. But and
he also had a different disposition. I mean, I've read it speculated that Padre Pio sort of he was maybe inclined towards skepticism because Padre Pio represented a little bit of a different era of Catholicism than Pope John the 23rd was trying to usher in with this more optimistic view of things. He made this speech. I don't know if it was the beginning of the Second Vatican Council or just before that, where he was saying, we don't believe these prophets of doom.
By the way, that could have been, he could have there even been referring to somebody like Sister Elena Aiello, who's in Calabria, and she died, I think, 1961. And so she's right smack in the middle of that, and she had just some extraordinary prophecies of doom. And in fact, let me give you an example of somebody who had quite a prophecy of doom, who just died. Is Sister Agnes from Japan, the Our Lady of Akita seer. And she's the one, October 13, 1973, which was the anniversary of the miracle of the sun at Fatima, October 13, 1917. And she's the one, in fact, it was her bishop, Ito, who said that the message of Akita is the message of Fatima. It was the same kind of message. And she had a vision of chastisement, ball of fire from the sky, bishops against bishops, clergy against clergy. Yeah. And I didn't even know until a couple years into this research that when I don't even know what prompted me to look at Sister Agnes at that point, but I tracked down the letter from Bishop Ito to see what it said. And he said that he approved the Akita visions as, quote, being of supernatural origin, unquote, the bishop did. And he noted that she had the stigmata. So she had the stigmata while she was having these visions. She was also cured of deafness at that time. Now, she went on to live a long time. I think when she died there a few weeks ago, she was in her early 90s. And I read, Thomas, maybe you saw this somewhere too, that supposedly her body was maybe donated to science at the time of her death, which would be very troubling if that's what they did. This woman ought to be encased in glass to see if she's incorruptible. But there's very little that we knew about her after these visions, other than that she went into a convent for a long time. She was interviewed a number of times. I know Drew Mariani of Relevant Radio actually was part of a documentary and went and interviewed her. I don't think she had stigmata again, not throughout the rest of her life for sure. And I don't think she had them at the time of her death or anywhere near the time of her death. but she's another modern stigmatist who had some really extraordinary visions. Very modern, 2024.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting too. I mean, I don't know. Of course, Saint John the 23rd has been canonized as well, and of course, I'm not questioning that. But it's just interesting to see sometimes it's sort of just a stark difference in vibe, let's say, between different saints. I mean, in the opening address of I was referencing the opening address of Vatican II. He is disagreeing with those who say that the modern age is deteriorating in comparison with past ages and things like that, which of course is very much the message of, God is, some of these visionaries are saying God is angrier with humanity now than he's ever been, and this is far worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And, it's worse than, I forget which one, maybe it was Elena Aiello's, like, worse, humanity is worse than at any point since the flood or something like that.
Hey, look, if I may, I just looked this up from the text of my book. And so I have John the 23rd. This is what I write. Unfortunately, was conflicted over Pio, given the calumnious reports he was receiving from Pio's enemies. It took yeoman's work from men like Archbishop Andrea Cesarano of Manfredonia and Cardinal Siri, this is Siri, Siri, to convince John the 23rd not to publicly denounce Pio. And Siri said this, quote, "For months, I defended Padre Pio to Pope John the 23rd. Get this quote. We spoke about him at every meeting we had. Each time we met, we ended up talking about Padre Pio. The Pope was a very good man, a true saint, but he was worried and confused about what was reported to him." So
when I read that passage of your book, I was Googling and trying to find out more about why was he so skeptical. And there are some quotes about him, about Padre Pio from John the 23rd that are very negative. But as you say, they come from his private writings and his journals and letters and things like that, not from any public denunciation that he made.
It's okay. I mean, the popes, even the ones that are saints, are human, like Padre Pio as well. In fact, the other one, Archbishop Andrea Cesarano, pleaded directly to John the 23rd of Pio. He said, "It's all slander. I've known Padre Pio since 1933. And Paul VI, I probably couldn't find this quick enough, although I could if I just hit probably. But Paul VI, I think, was likewise a bit more conflicted, but overall, I think was favorable in what he
he seemed to have been more favorable to Padre Pio than John the 23rd.
But there's a great lesson to be learned here. So in every age, these people are doubted. And there are right now people in the world claiming to have stigmata. In fact, there's an Italian woman named Gisella Cardia, and she's a sensation in Italy. She's been on all their kind of Good Morning America type shows. There's video of her online with an Italian doctor from Milan, a female doctor, and some sort of a British guy who, I don't know if he's clergy or what, I'm not exactly sure, but it looks like she's got oil coming out of her palms, maybe blood. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And the Vatican, she's had all kinds of prophecies alleged. The Vatican did some sort of an investigation of her a few months ago, and ruled unfavorably against her, but didn't say anything about her stigmata, which I was really troubled by, because I thought, well, surely the stigmata is the easy part of this, right? Bring in your doctors, and she was being posted on the website Countdown to the Kingdom, right?
Right.
And they pulled her after the negative judgment of the Vatican. But it just goes to show, right, that this stuff in every age, Therese Newman is still doubted. She's not a saint yet. And Catherine Emmerich. I have a whole chapter on her. She's probably the greatest visionary in the history of the church. She's a blessed.
Right.
And she died, I think, around 1824. And there are people to this day who doubt whether, I can't remember his name right now, but the guy who recorded all of her visions, Brentano? There are people
Brentano.
there are people this day that doubt him and whether or not he was, if he was elaborating or not elaborating, exaggerating some of her visions.
Well, the Vatican, when they beatified her, there was a statement that they were not taking the writings into consideration because they couldn't vouch for whether they were actually her. Well, they're not her writings in the strict sense, regardless of what your position. It's his writings, his notes, basically. But they basically said, like, we can't vouch for the authenticity in the textual sense, not even in the spiritual sense, the textual authenticity of these, whether these are really all word for word her visions and stuff, and therefore we're just judging her personal holiness and beatifying her. We're not approving the writings. And I'll be honest, sometimes I wonder about it too. There's passages in there about the curse of Ham leading to the existence of black people and referring to the nobler races being of lighter color and stuff that would have been very current in Germany of the time. And of course Pope Benedict has written about how even authentic private revelations do not necessarily exclude occasional distortions or misinterpretations by the visionaries themselves. So that doesn't necessarily speak against the overall authenticity. It's not something that I've looked into.
She would say very often, in fact, one of the things I liked about a lot of her visions was she would say, I'm unclear on this, I'm fuzzy on this, but I was told that the devil was going to be unchained from hell for a period of 50 to 60 years before the year 2000. Right, that's a striking prophecy right there. Right,
that works.
And she would say, I can't remember if it was 50 or 60, but again, you don't know. But what is a lot easier to try to verify are not the private revelations and visions, but the bleeding from the hands.
Yes, that's right, because those are the things that they've had doctors coming in to study them.
Right.
And
that's
all
what
sorts
strikes
of
me.
Tests and doubts and stuff. You can't really test a prophecy until it comes true or doesn't, right?
Right.
But you can test the stigmata then and there. And you go into a lot of detail about that. Yeah, and in one of the final chapters, you mentioned Cardi. Is that her name?
Yeah, Cardia, Gisela Cardia.
So, I mean, that was one of the ones that I was skeptical of reading in one of the final chapters of your book. And to be clear, most of the book is focused on canonized or beatified stigmatists. Right. But there's a couple of final chapters dealing in a semi-agnostic way with some of the more modern claims. There was one message from her that I think was claimed to be from Mary about, COVID vaccines messing with people's DNA and stuff. And I just sort of immediately dismissed that. Another one who is mentioned that I'm very skeptical of, is Adrienne von Speyer, who I tend to agree with Ralph Martin's critique of her as a false mystic, not necessarily deliberately fraudulent, but maybe operating under deceptions. But the great thing is we have all these really well attested stigmatists like Padre Pio and like Sister Elena Aiello, and she was the one of the ones that you devoted a lot of time. She was the only one that I had never heard of Blessed Elena.
Right. Yeah, hardly anyone's heard of her. Yeah.
That was quite interesting. I mean, her messages to Mussolini.
Those were dead
literally
on.
Writing letters to Mussolini just before. Was it just before Italy's entry into the war, or just as Italy was entering World War II?
Throughout the period, in fact, she had quite a relationship with Mussolini's sister, and she predicted things like, the Lord is telling me that he has a chance at this time to change, save Italy, do the right thing, and if not, this is going to end very bad, very bad for him.
The warning was that he should not enter the war.
I mean, her prophecies about Mussolini are really spot on, and what really struck me about her...
She said he would come to a bad end, basically.
Yeah, I can't remember if she said flat out that he would be killed.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like for me when I was a Protestant and I first learned about Fatima, and I'm a Cold War scholar. And so I read the alleged prophecies of these little shepherd children in this little village in Fatima, Portugal, about Bolshevism and all, and I knew as a historian, I thought, if these kids really said things like this, I mean, that an 8-year-old named Jacinta or Lucia or Francisco, they can't make up this stuff. I mean, this is too spot on. And I felt that way about the kind of politics and international events that Elena Aiello was nailing in,
Right.
in her prophecies. It just seemed like the kind of thing that somebody really couldn't make up.
Okay, so we're talking a lot about visions and prophecies. Is that because stigmatists tend to be visionaries? Not necessarily always prophesying future events, though, right? They may have visions that are more devotional revelations. They may have visions that are about the future, or they may have gifts of reading souls in the here and now. Like you pointed out, Padre Pio was more about saving individual souls than he was about, prophesying far into the future, right?
Yeah, at least as far as we know. But he would also tell people that he met, allegedly, he knew when they were going to die in some cases, right? And he would know whether or not somebody should get an operation that they needed.
Right, but so I meant like worldwide sort of grand scale things.
Right,
yeah.
The grand scale ones. But there have been a lot of those, too. Our Lady of Akita, and even Sister Faustina Kowalska, who's the first canonized saint of the new millennium.
Right.
And she was 1905 to 1938. She died at the age of 33, same age as Jesus, just like Catherine of Siena, 33 years old. Like Catherine of Siena, she had the hidden stigmata. Now, I know right then and there, a lot of people are, we being skeptics, we're going to say, if they're hidden, I'm not buying that, right? but she was, look, read her diary. This doesn't sound like somebody who's gonna fake something like that. And she was all the time constantly being challenged by other nuns in the convent who were trying to say that she was lazy, wasn't really sick, was a malingerer, a faker. Right. You just don't want to do the dishes. And in her case, God gave her invisible stigmata, which probably humbled her even more, right? I mean,
right.
I suppose God could have given her visible stigmata, and at that point showed all the other nuns in the convent, everything you just said about sister is really vicious, because look, she's now bleeding from her hands.
Right.
She's got the marks of Christ.
Yeah. Instead,
she's bleeding, she's invisibly bleeding, and only she knows it. And she can't tell anybody that except her diary. That's somebody I'm more inclined to believe rather than disbelieve.
And the ones who did have visible stigmata generally wished it was invisible or tried to hide it out of humility or simply out of desire to stop being poked and prodded by people as well, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, none of them really wanted it, right? I mean, they all felt they were unworthy. I mean, the moment that it happens to Francis, and we just recognized the 800th anniversary of his stigmata, September 17th, 2024. So 1224 is when it happened. But with Francis, with Pio, I mean, Pio's sobbing. He's like, Lord, don't do this. Don't do this. I am unworthy. I am unworthy. And it comes from the cross at Our Lady of Grace Chapel at San Giovanni Rotondo, just as it did with Catherine of Siena. In fact, Catherine of Siena, on the cover of the book, those rays are coming from the cross, the crucifix. My son was just there in Siena last summer, and he sent me a picture of the cross and at the church. I thought, oh, wow, that's where it happened. But Pio is being struck through the hands and through the palms, and he's bleeding, and he's crying, not just because he's in pain, but he's just thinking, Lord, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of this. And he's alone. He drags himself back to his cell. And the way that he's found out is the brothers come back and see a trail of blood from the chapel all the way to his cell. So they start knocking on the door. Francesco, that was Pio's name, Francesco Forgione. Are you okay? Are you okay? He's don't open the door. Don't open the door. And then finally his superior comes in and under obedience, right, says, Francesco, let me look at your hands. And he looks at him and he's like, the guy's bleeding from his hands. He's not sitting there, jamming a pen or a screwdriver or a knife through him or, pouring acid on him like, some crazy people thought. No, he's bleeding. And it's one of the kind of cornball psychiatrists of the day. This is probably one level below snake handling, said, I know what's causing this. It is autosuggestion. Autosuggestion is causing the bleeding from his palms. And Pio's like, autosuggestion. Well, tell him to imagine that he's a bull, and let's see if he grows horns out of his head. Huh, right? I mean, come on, auto-suggestion?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a bigger leap of faith than Christ giving you the stigmata. So let me see if I can do this. Hands bleed. 50 years.
It's like the mass hallucination theory of the resurrection, right?
Right,
It does. It's a lot more incredible, actually.
It's actually, it's probably even a farther, more of a stretch than that, because Pio bled for 50 years.
Okay, so you just mentioned that, this book is coming out around the 800th anniversary of St. Francis's Stigmata, which is amazing. So that raises the question, is the stigmata a phenomenon that really begins in the Middle Ages? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Francis is regarded as the first, typically, okay? And he had him at the end of his life, a life of severe penance and mortification. But it often seems a common characteristic with many of these stigmatists is they're sick and suffering, almost even dying for a long time. And all along kind of offering up their suffering. It's almost as if Christ is putting them through a period of physical preparation, spiritual preparation, to see if these are the kind of people that have the spiritual mettle to be able to identify with him on the cross, right? In this unique way. So but Francis is typically regarded as the first. However, in the New Testament, in Galatians, I think it's Galatians 6:17, St. Paul says, "I bear the marks of Jesus Christ on my body." And that's where the Greek stigmata comes from, marks. Now, some have believed that some think that when he's talking there, he's talking kind of more generally about the fact that he was shipwrecked at sea all these times, flogged all these times, stoned, and had all these other sufferings, kind of, his cross to carry, if you will. But others think, he might be referring here to actual stigmata. Maybe Paul was the first stigmatist. Really interesting. Therese Newman and Catherine Emmerich, who, as we've talked about, were two of the greatest visionaries in the history of the church, who claimed to be able to see things in the life of Jesus, in the life of Mary, and even see, Adrian von Speer claimed a lot of those things too, right? Claimed to be able to see the lives of apostles and other people. They both said and told their spiritual director that, one, they saw Francis receive the stigmata because they could see backward. And two, they both said he actually was the second to receive the stigmata. Paul was the first. So we have two German female stigmatists, fairly modern.
That's Newman and
Catherine
Emmerich. Okay.
Yeah. So we've got two German female stigmatists who tell us, hey, St. Paul was the first. I saw it. For whatever that's worth.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. But I mean, either way, even if St. Paul was the first, I wonder why it doesn't happen again in recorded history until St. Francis. And maybe it's just a new age of the church, and God is introducing new graces, new signs. I don't know. It's
the alter Christus, right?
I mean, this is the sort of thing. It's interesting because I've been listening, reading up on the Orthodox. The Orthodox Church is becoming more prominent in religious life in America these days, especially if you're spending time online. You encounter a lot more Orthodox people and people converting to Orthodoxy, perhaps from Protestantism or otherwise. But that's one of those things that they would claim, well, like, we didn't see this in the first millennium and therefore it's not valid. Like, so forms of devotion, for instance,
Marian apparitions?
Yeah, Marian apparitions, forms of devotion that maybe seem too emotionalistic to them, or the Sacred Heart and sort of the devotional life, because there is a shift in beginning with the medieval ages. There are new developments in devotional life. I feel like that the human nature of Christ maybe gets more and more emphasized over the past 1,000 years. Obviously that's a big part of the Sacred Heart devotion, but I don't know. I mean, if the church is a historical entity which lives and grows in history, and
right.
It's not like these things are. It's not like the stigmata is saying anything that hadn't been said in Catholic spirituality before. Right? We are supposed to fill up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ, right? We are supposed to participate in Christ's sufferings for.
If you want to follow me, pick up your cross.
Right? Yeah. So,
and a lot of the stigmatists said that the most vexing wound that Jesus had, and that several of that people think of the stigmata palms, feet, and side, maybe even crown of thorns or a single thorn like Rita of Cascia have had. A number of these stigmatists had the shoulder wound of Christ.
Yes,
And
yeah.
I
So
find that
supposedly
fascinating
Padre Pio,
theologically.
supposedly
Because
Saint Padre Pio
Jesus,
had that.
Jesus said, if you want to follow me, pick up your cross and carry it. So the fact that they would have the shoulder wound and that would be kind of the most vexing wound of all is, I think, spiritually kind of profound.
And Blessed Elena Aiello also sweat blood, correct?
Yeah, she did. But on your point, as you mentioned, Orthodox and so forth, one could possibly say here that people in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, they had the advantage of being closer in time, proximity to people who had known apostles or physically had seen Jesus. But the further that you get away from that over time, maybe you need to see some sort of physical manifestations in things, especially in our skeptical age. So you might not need to see people with a stigmata in the year 400, but we get to the point with Francis around the year 1200, 1224 to be exact, that God in the course of history, right, decides to intervene by bringing in something altogether new. It could be apparitions, it could be Eucharistic miracles, right? It could be stigmata. And here we are in our age today. I mean, for me personally, even when I was an agnostic, when I was non-Catholic, when I was Protestant, to know that there were some suffering souls out there that were having the bleeding wounds of Christ, that did a lot for my faith, I got to tell you. I mean, the first time I saw video footage of that and pictures with people like Pio, I mean, I was up all night looking at this. Wow, is that real? Look at that. They're not faking it. Look at that. What do we do with that? And I'm reading more and more and more. Then you read doctors' reports and formal depositions and statements from agnostics and atheists and psychiatrists. And the more I kept reading, I thought, this is real. Okay, this person has the wounds of Christ. That helped my faith.
Right.
I've always been the doubting Thomas, right? Unless I could put my finger in the holes in his hands, I'm not going to believe. That's how I am. So for me, things like that help my faith.
So we're, in the Catholic Church, we're not just about signs and wonders, just for the flashy colors of it all, or the sort of the novelty of it all, right? And so these stigmatists, they're going through experiences that we don't go through. They can be very intimidating at times. Obviously, the things that they said for other people, the prophecies they made, the spiritual advice they may have given, those things are things that we can take away from. But yeah, so as far as just continue on that point you were saying, as far as the stigmata itself, like that phenomenon in itself, what does reflecting on that do for your spiritual life, aside from sort of increasing your faith because it's a miraculous phenomenon? What do you find that it contributes to your life, looking at something that in an external sense you can't participate in unless God chooses to give you this gift?
Well, when I was an evangelical in the 1990s, right, the health and wealth gospel was very popular. It still is. And I remember I used to listen to Focus on the Family and shows like that. And I still respect all those guys, James Dobson, everybody. But there were a number of evangelicals producing books with titles like, "Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People?" Right? Mm-hmm. I became a Christian, right? I've been saved. Why are these people around me suffering and dying? Why? Right? And Catholics have a better understanding of suffering. And I remember an argument one time that I witnessed between an evangelical and a Catholic, and the evangelical was saying, in your Catholic churches, you got Jesus hanging on the cross, right? But Christ is risen, brother. He's risen indeed, right? In our churches, it's an empty cross, right? The Catholic's like, what are you going with this, right? And it's like, well, we know that he we know that he is risen. But when you go into a Catholic church and you're suffering and someone in your family has died, or you've lost a child or some sort of trauma, you walk in and you see that bleeding Jesus. You see him suffering. And it's like, oh yeah, he told us, if you want to follow me, pick up your cross and suffer, right? Pick up your cross and carry it. And evangelicals would have the phrase WWJD, what would Jesus do? What Jesus would do is suffer. he would get holes in his hands, right? He would bleed. He would die for you, right? He wouldn't just work to get that early retirement at age 55 or 60, so he could go on vacation somewhere, right? He would suffer. Mortification, offering it up. That phrase, the first time I heard the phrase from a group of older Catholic women about, you're going through this, you're suffering right now, you're in this physical pain, offer it up. And I thought, offer it up? What does that mean? Offer it up. Offer up your suffering, give it to Jesus, give it to God, ask him to do something with it for some sort of beneficial purpose, right? And that whole concept is just so alien to Protestants. I marked this page because I thought, I read this last night as I was going through the Gemma Galgani chapter again, because I haven't read it since I wrote it about 6 months ago. But this is a remarkable thing. Jesus asked Gemma Galgani this: how long has it been since you last prayed for the souls in purgatory? She asked Jesus a question in response. Do bodily pains relieve the souls in purgatory? Yes, answered Jesus. Yes, daughter, even the smallest suffering gives relief.
And this is when she was a little girl, right?
Yeah, at that point, she was, I think 1885. I think she was only 7 years old. I believe so. And there's passages like that from Catherine of Siena, from Faustina. Those women are suffering so much that they die at the age of 33 from all the different ailments that they had. And a couple of remarks, I wish I could find the one quickly right now, but Jesus says something like, you can't even imagine what good your suffering can do when you offer to unite it to my suffering. And Faustina says that too, right? If only people knew the incredible spiritual benefit in the afterlife for suffering souls, for expiation of sins that can come through offering up your suffering, then people would embrace suffering rather than run away from it.
Right.
So this is a Catholic thing, man, that you just don't get in like health and wealth gospel, Joel Osteen, evangelical Protestantism.
Yeah, I mean,
the
I can say...
Look at the Pieta.
Right. Yeah, I can say for myself just the experience that I had reading about the major stigmatists that you cover in the book. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to read about this stuff because it's very challenging. It focuses you on the suffering of Christ. It focuses you on our call, like you said, to carry our cross, and how so much of the Christian life is about embracing suffering in a spirit of charity and offering it up. And it makes me it makes me feel bad about myself in a good way. Like, it reminds me of like how little I'm doing for God. It reminds me of how much worse my sins are than some of these. I mean, you mentioned, I think it was Saint Gemma Galgani making this intense act of contrition for all her sins, and then later in the chapter you say that the priest who knew her said that she, as far as he could tell, she had never committed a mortal sin in her life.
I know, it's funny.
And many of us have committed over 1,000 mortal sins by the time we, turn 35. So, it's striking that, the need for penance, the need for reparation, they bring forth all these things that modern Catholics are really not comfortable with. And also, I think people who are some people, not all, who are more intellectually disposed would prefer to read, rather than reading the diary of, St. Faustina or something that really gets right to your heart and kind of burns you as you read it in both joyful and painful ways. I think some people would prefer to read something that's more of an intellectual treatise, or even if it's by a saint, it's something that is more, more sort of just like a work of speculative theology or something like that. But this stuff, and especially whenever you read about these female religious saints who, just gave everything to God in this complete surrender. They
don't even eat.
It's
some
profoundly,
cases they eat nothing but the Eucharist.
It's profoundly challenging, and I know that people are tempted to run away from this stuff or to belittle it. And I know that because I feel that in myself. Like, I feel the fear of confronting these these saints in myself, as I'm reading it. So,
but hey, I'll make you feel better. So it's like it's their charism, it's their call. Now yours might be evangelization through media, through Catholic culture, through your podcasts. It might be as a missionary. It might be as a medical missionary. It might be as a priest, as a nun. These unique souls, and in history, we think there's been about 400 or 500 of them out of 10 billion plus people who've lived. I don't know how many people have lived.
Right.
They've been called to a very unique level, different call, altogether different. And they're unique enough that they can embrace it and they can do it. They obviously, God hasn't asked me or you to do this because he knows we probably couldn't pull it off, right? But Gemma Galgani, in one of the exchanges she has with the Blessed Mother, she says something like, I'm willing to suffer for Jesus always, even in heaven, I'm willing to do this. And the Blessed Mother says something like, oh honey, there's no suffering in heaven.
Right.
Yeah, you don't have to do that. All right.
Yeah.
You're good. Although, as I talk about with Gemma Galgani, her call in the afterlife seems to be, if you talk to a number of modern exorcists, and I quote about a half a dozen of them, is that she's this powerful intercessor in exorcisms. And she frequently appears in these exorcisms. And what did she do amid her suffering? She fought the devil and demons physically, unlike probably any other person in this book other than Padre Pio. Right. So she got physically beat up and physically assaulted. Right. And I call her, to borrow from St. Joseph, terror of demons. One exorcist said that he was doing a particularly challenging exorcism, and near the end of it, he asked the demon to declare itself and its name. And the demon said something like, oh no, she's here. She's here, the woman in black. And the exorcist says, who's that? Thinking maybe it's the Blessed Mother. She said, and the demon said, Gemma Galgani. I hate her. She's disgusting. I hate her. So in a way, it's as if she was prepared in life and taken at the age of 25. Right. And never went into a convent like she once wanted to do, in order to prepare for this post-earthly role as a powerful intercessor in exorcisms or whatever else.
Yeah. And just on your point, yes, it's like, obviously I'm not called to have the stigmata, perhaps not called to be a victim soul in the sort of the most intense sense of that. But I do think that comparing ourselves to these or confronting ourselves with these examples is still valuable. It's like, okay, I may not have that calling, but I still shouldn't let myself off the hook so easily, because there is something universal here. There is something universal, as you were saying, about the Christian life here. And it's sort of like the religious life, how the reason so many canonized saints are religious is because they are a visible example of living the evangelical counsels in the most radical way. And we're all meant to imitate them, even if not in every external of the state and life. We're all meant to imitate them on a spiritual level according to our state and life. And so I think sometimes we let ourselves off the hook too easily. Well, I'm not a nun, I'm not a priest, I don't need to do that, but
hey, I'm not Mother Teresa.
Yeah, exactly. But what I think the biggest thing that I'm reminded of in reading the stories in this book is I'm called to, run a Catholic website and do podcasts and stuff. But what it reminds me is, like, none of that really matters in comparison with my prayer life and my conversion and my penance and everything else that I'm supposed to be doing. That those are the things that would make my work in the world fruitful in the first place, for something fruitful for eternal life, not just for some human end. And so it's great to be challenged in that way and to be reminded, like, the only thing that counts at the end of the day is how much you are conformed to, Christ and his cross. So
but that's a good way to put it. Conform to Christ and his cross.
And so it reminds me of these saints. These saints, I have saints that, their spiritual writings inform my spiritual life, and I have saints who I can relate to on a more human level. So I love, Saint Faustina, Saint Louis de Montfort. Their writings are very influential. And then people like John Henry Newman, Thomas More, my patron saint, Saint John Paul II. Of course, I love their writings, but I can also just relate to them on a human level, and just we have similar interests. Their personalities are appealing to me. But when I read these, especially I find whenever I read about the great female religious mystics, what I'm reminded of is like they don't really have any time for anything else except for God and prayer and penance. And it just reminds me of like, don't fool yourself. Everything has to be fueled by that, and everything has to be in God's eyes. Everything you do in your life, in a way, has to be in God's eyes connected to that or reducible to that, so that because otherwise it's all just going to be burned away. Everything we're doing in this world is burned away when we die, and it's only the spirit of charity that animates it that remains. So,
Thomas Aquinas, right? Everything is just straw compared to to the vision that he just saw.
Right. So I think that's when we're reading about stigmatics or visions or anything like that, it's important to not to just look at it as like a kind of a marvel, like the people who asked Jesus to perform wonders and things like that, but to actually be challenged on it on a deeper level, because looking at it as a marvel is kind of another way of looking at it as a foreign thing that doesn't really touch my soul. It's just this thing that I kind of external to me that I kind of marvel at and say, wow, isn't that amazing? At the very least, if we're not to follow in the exact footsteps of those saints, we're supposed to at least allow their example to keep us humble about our own small sufferings.
It's one thing to see the Blessed Mother and the miracle of the Sun and the apparition at Fatima, right?
Right.
Wow. So it's the physical, miracle manifestation, like the stigmata that gets your attention. But then the question is, what are they telling us? What do they want us to take away from this? What's the message here, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why what she said at Fatima from her mouth matters, and what a lot of these people said as well matters.
That's right. Yeah. Now, you said 400 or 500 in total in history, maybe like that are maybe, I don't know if they're all church approved exactly, or just sort of deemed by scholars to be likely authentic. Is that?
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. I go through it very carefully in the book. I don't know that there's an official Vatican list. Man, I really wish there was, right? But there was a book in 1894 by a French doctor who at that point came up with a list of about 300. And he said that they were all Catholics that he had come up with. There's a group in Belgium, a university in Belgium, in Antwerp, Belgium, that tracks these, and they try to note which are true and which aren't. It's not a church affiliated group, so that one's a little bit more difficult to navigate. Michael Fries, who's an author who did a book over 30 years ago, he went through a bunch of different examples, and he's the one I think that said the 20th century is the era of the stigmatists, because there have been so many in the 20th century. I'm trying to remember the deacon for Tan Books and his Compendium of the Miraculous, and he continues to do research on this. He's now into his 90s, and he's been keeping track of cases all the way up through the current day. So altogether, taking these different lists, I said it looks like there have been probably about 400 to 500 that most people would deem, appear to be authentic. And I know that's not as precise as people would like, but
sure,
I'm trying to be scholarly and academic about it. I don't want to just give a hard number, because that wouldn't be accurate either.
At the beginning of the book, you have a nice overview of breakdown of sort of the demographics of stigmatists, what they have in common, how many of them have, how many, some of them have a thorn, some of them don't, how many of them are religious, what religious orders have the most stigmatists, isn't it? Dominicans have the most? Is that right?
I think so. I believe so. It's pretty close.
And then you also talk about the question of why are most of them women? What is it about the female?
Over 90% are women.
Yeah.
Over 90% are women. And there's some great quotes there from some of the different spiritual directors and clergy and Vatican people on that. One says something like, a woman is called to love and suffer more than a man is. A woman can embrace love and suffering more than a man can. And I think there's something to that. I mean, certainly I could tell you in the case of my marriage, if something happens if one of the kids wakes up in the middle of the night, one of the babies crying and screaming, I just roll over and go back to sleep. My wife jumps up and salutes the flag and bursts out into the room to take care of things. But I think women are kind of more inclined to kind of love and suffering and identify in that way. My wife will often say to me, you're such a big baby, right? What's hurting on you, right?
Well, something that just occurred to me too is that like women can't be priests. And so maybe this is something that God gives more to female religious.
Right.
I wouldn't say as a compensation exactly, but the point being that priests are already alter Christus and conform to Christ in a very unique way.
Yeah.
And so there's I don't know, maybe there's something to
I love that. I think that's
being given this opportunity to also show that women are supposed to be conformed to Christ as well, even if not through holy orders.
Yeah.
I don't know.
In a very different way. But by the way, a priest would have a hard time carrying the stigmata, right, for 50 years and carrying out the duties of a priest. Now Pio pulled it off, right? But it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy in his case. And the other kind of interesting demographic, about 70% of them have come from Italy. Now that's because
those are the people that the Vatican pays attention to.
More saints have come from Italy than any other country.
Right.
But I actually quote a couple of different Vatican officials on that, including some that aren't Italian, and they just talk about the way how emotional Italian people are. And I'm half Italian. You wouldn't know it from my Polish last name, but my mom's 100% Italian, and anybody who has Italian relatives. This doesn't surprise you that they would. They really are different people. If you spend any time in Italy, the Italian people are very different. They're really fun and loving and emotional, and I get it. If I had to bet money on which country would be more prone to have the most stigmatists, I'd put it in Italy. I could probably give more reasons that wouldn't be very scientific, but the second most common is France, and I think Germany is third. Now, an interesting thing more recently, Hilaire Belloc said the faith is Europe and Europe is the faith. Well, the faith has really declined in Europe, and Europe's been going through a voluntary de-Christianization. So now we're seeing more and more stigmatists from outside of Europe. So they are now more geographically, globally diverse than they have been at any other time in history. And I think that that's a reflection of the genuine universality of the church that we didn't see a couple hundred years ago.
Great. So one more question, just as a teaser for the listeners. So how many are the stigmatists that you devote a whole chapter to? How many do you cover in depth like that?
Yeah, 7 altogether, I believe. So
could you just list those in case there are any we haven't mentioned?
Sure. St. Francis of Assisi, he's the first, and he died 1226. Catherine of Siena, 1347 to 1380. And then after that, I jump forward to a bunch of I cover a whole bunch of them, as you know, in the book. But as far as individual chapters, after that, Padre Pio, Sister Elena Aiello, Gemma Galgani, Faustina Kowalska, and Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich.
So that's the list of the most detailed.
Right, and they're all blesseds and saints. I tried to focus on them because, to me, it's just a higher level of stamp of approval of the church. I do note in the end of the book some people like Marie Julie Jeheni, who she's like the 3 Days of Darkness person. She actually had stigmata for a really long time. She's not a saint. She's not. I don't think she's a blessed. There's people like Anna Maria Taigi as well, and she's also a Days of Darkness person, and she had stigmata. And interestingly, everyone identifies her with 3 Days of Darkness. And I think beeswax candles as well, right? All of that stuff. Hardly anyone notes that she's a stigmatist, but her principal biographer does. So I was often surprised as I dug more and more into this to learn, oh, wow, I didn't know that she was a stigmatist.
Right. Yeah, well, I didn't actually, I haven't, to my shame, yet finished the Diary of St. Faustina, and I don't think I've gotten to the part where she received stigmata yet.
Yeah.
So I either
it's kind
didn't
of
know
buried in
that,
there.
I didn't know that, or had forgotten. And I think same with St. Catherine of Siena. But you also spent quite a bit of time on St. Rita in the introductory chapter, which was very nice because
St. Rita of Castro, she's one of my favorites.
She's such an awesome saint. Yeah.
Single crown of single thorn from the crown of thorns that she suffered from, that smelled. It had a bad odor, and people often didn't want to be around her because it oozed, and it didn't, now, interestingly, in so many of the cases of these stigmatists, the wounds don't smell, they don't get infected, and
right.
I don't think her thorn ever got infected, but at the time of her death, it completely changed, where she had instead exuded this like perfume. Like smell. It wasn't malodorous anymore, but a pleasant odor.
Well, the Orthodox are all about the good odor of the corpses of their saints, so they can at least appreciate that one.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, Paul, thanks for writing this book. It was an edifying read, and thank you so much for coming back on.
A lot better writing about this, Thomas, than Karl Marx and the devil, let me tell you.
Yeah, talk about somebody who smelled in a bad way.
Truly.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, thanks. I'll join you anytime. Enjoy your show.
All right. Everybody, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.